The primary issue we face by living in our physical bodies is that we've got all these sensory apparatus and we've got our mind, and if we're not careful, all we do is we become dominant in the use of our sensory apparatus and our mind. And that's all we ever consider. So we only ever consider, oh, it tastes good. It doesn't matter if it's like, you know, chocolate, that's fair trade, not fair trade, whatever. It just tastes good, so we have it. We don't consider the consequences of our decisions. And like some alcohol might taste good to us. So tastes good, so we have it. Or makes me feel good, so I have it. So we end up being driven, if we're not careful, we end up being driven by just what the senses demand and our mind's ability to supply the demand. In other words, we pursue in our life the thing that the sense demands we have. So you can liken that to a child who's given candy at a young age, and then they always want candy. Now, if the parent just accedes to that wish of the child, what is going to be the end result? The toothpicks will eventually get so bad, won't they, that they won't be able to be utilised by the child as an adult. And they'll end up probably losing all of their teeth, even if they continue having a bad diet that affects their teeth. So if you're just driven by a sense, and then you just use your mind and your goals in life to feed the desire that sense has for a substance or a condition, you can see you can end up doing a lot of very unloving things towards yourself and also towards others. So a person, for example, who loves the taste of food and loves food and everything, if they don't have some kind of emotional restriction upon that, they'll end up being so big that they can't get out of the house. Right? If your senses are going to be the thing you use to dominate your life, the net result is going to be that you end up with a very restricted life. Right? And which is actually telling us that there's something wrong with the way we're using our senses. So an example of that is, if I overeat, my life becomes more and more restricted because I put overweight, my organs start failing, I have all these other problems that start occurring, and that is telling me there's something wrong with the way I'm satisfying myself. I need to change that somehow. And obviously it's emotionally driven, so I need to find the emotions that drive it. But when we become this physical body centric, we ignore that. And this is why people die from eating badly, or die from cigarette smoking, or die from alcohol abuse, or die from addiction to drugs, or, you know, all of these things that so many people on earth have severe problems with that eventually cause severe sicknesses and even death. At the end of the day, they're all because we're focused here and we don't understand the operation of the soul, and that there's morals associated with what we do. So let's look at some things regarding law with regard to the soul, in terms of how the soul is operating. This soul is governed by a hierarchy of laws. Some of the hierarchy starts with what are physical restrictions, or you could say physical capacity of the soul itself. So an example of that is, if your soul is in a certain condition of love, you will not be able to, in a fairly bad condition of love, you will never be able to progress beyond the first sphere of the spirit world while that occurs. So that's the example of a physical restriction placed upon the soul because of its spiritual development. Right? So there's physical restrictions. Then there is also what we would classify as more spiritual restrictions. Now, so a spiritual restriction is what happens to the bodies when the soul is out of harmony with the law. What happens is there are spiritual restrictions that are placed upon the soul that then have physical consequences on the bodies. So the spiritual restrictions are more restrictions revolving around what you would classify as the way energy works in your body and the way energy works in your spirit body and these kind of things. So there are restrictions placed upon these functionings of your soul that then have an impact upon the energy systems that govern the bodies. And this is why we eventually get sick. This is why we have sicknesses that we can't eradicate in our body, and sometimes permanent sicknesses that result in death, like cancers and things like that. They all come from these spiritual restrictions that are upon our soul that exhibit themselves as physical restrictions in our bodies. Right? So on top of that now, there's also the highest laws are, you could say, soul-based restrictions. So I'll just... And these are very interesting types of restrictions because they affect all of these kind of emotional states of the soul. In other words, when your soul is in a certain state, it's impossible to be happy. An example of that is when if you ever visit the hells of the spirit world, you'll see they are populated by people who are extremely unhappy all the time. It's impossible for them to be happy. And the reason why it's impossible for them to be happy is because there are soul restrictions stopping them from being happy while they remain in an unloving condition. So there's all these feedback systems that are that God's designed into the law that governs your soul. And the key for us in terms of understanding our own soul is to go, okay, what are the most important things I can do to free up my soul, to make my soul have less restrictions? Right? If you want to be happy, happiness comes from having a sense of freedom to do whatever you want in harmony with love. The trouble with us is that because, as we pointed out with our senses, we're just feeding the senses with no consideration of love. So a person who's overeating is feeding the sense of taste and smell and satisfaction, a feeling in their tummy of satisfaction. They're feeding those senses with no consideration of whether it's loving to themselves or not. Right? And when we have no consideration of whether something's loving to ourselves or to others, these restrictions will be put in place upon our soul. You follow that? And these restrictions, there are many, many, by the way, of these restrictions that get placed upon the soul. If you are if you are connected to your soul, you will feel every one of them instantly. So you will do something and you'll go, restriction straight away. You'll know you've just been, the law has governed you. Right? It's telling you where you're going here is going to be bad for you. Right? So there's the, you could say all of that is the law-based restrictions. Right? So they are those. Now, of course, there is millions of laws, and of course that also means there's millions of potential types of restrictions that can be put upon your soul given your actions. So every single action you take that is unloving will have a restriction, and the restriction will be felt in 3 different areas of your life. It will be felt upon your physical body, it will be felt upon your spirit body, and it will be felt upon your soul. And every time you choose to do something out of harmony with love, these restrictions will be put in place, and they will only be removed if you compensate for what you did. And what I mean by compensate is you fix what you did, or you attempt to. You have a desire to fix it. Does that make sense to everyone? So these restrictions, these law-based restrictions, you could say are God's feedback system to you. This is without you having a relationship with God. There's this feedback system going on. And these restrictions are very much based upon something that humans have invented as a word, and it's an appropriate word called morals. So in other words, anything that involves a moral, now let's define a moral. A moral is God's definition of what is true or what is false. That's a moral. So, and it applies to your spiritual condition.